Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and I had a subscriber ask really a fantastic question. I'll flip it in for you guys, and he's basically saying, hey, how come in emergency or life and death situations, people are suddenly stronger than they are the rest of the time? And I'll discuss that, kind of some examples of that, but let me put on my +5 hat of weaponsmithing, do a little bit of crafting, and let's talk about this. All right, great question. And this is something some strength and conditioning coaches actually do talk about out there. This is not an unknown subject in the strength training world, believe it or not. But great question nonetheless. So let's dig into it. All right, we hear stories out there, and there are documented cases of this, of people who and their children are in danger, or something is falling on their child, or there's some struggle where they have to exert maximum effort to save themselves or save the life of someone they care about, particularly when it's a child, because there is something to be said for the strength of a parent whose child is in danger. It's really an interesting bond in us as a species. That bond is actually quite strong. So yeah, there have been cases of mothers who probably could never deadlift more than 150 pounds, picking up something 250 pounds off of their child. Been documented cases, and then later in a lab they can't lift anywhere near that. They can't even get within 100 pounds of it sometimes. What in the hell's going on? Well, what it is that when your flight or fight response kicks in and you know that you are in true danger, or like your child is in immediate life and death danger, humans are able to overcome some of the fail-safes in their nervous system. Because what happens is that most of the time you can't activate maximum force in a muscle. You can get pretty good. You can activate a pretty good chunk of it, but it's not your maximum force that your muscles, if every muscle fiber in a muscle were to contract simultaneously, it's going to produce more force than you're normally going to hit at any time if you were to just push or pull something as hard as you could. And our bodies don't do that because they will generally thicken muscle fibers and thicken tendons over time to keep them from tearing. All right, that's what you're doing with weight training. You're subjecting tissue in your body to a workload that just causes enough trauma and disruption in it that it realizes it needs to thicken, because if you keep doing that, you're eventually going to tear it. But even then, I mean, you're working with loads that are less than your max, and your body still knows it will tear them eventually. And the reason for that is because it can tear it. If your muscles contract maximally, they are capable of ripping themselves, and they are capable of ripping tendons off the bone. And we know when we've hooked up people to electrodes and labs and stuff that, yeah, this has happened even on a bicep and stuff. That make it fire maximally. Yeah, sometimes they rip their bicep off. And it's absolutely happened. And it's crazy, it's really crazy when you think about it, but that strength is there in reserve in case it's a life and death struggle. Because your body, it's not that you aren't that strong all the time, you really are. It's that your body limits it to keep you from getting an injury that could cause you to die or be incapacitated later. This is to keep you alive. It's a survival mechanism. Our strength is limited by our nervous system as a survival mechanism to keep you from permanently injuring yourself, because all throughout history we don't have surgeries to reattach these things. You rip something off the bone, it's going to stay ripped off. All right, so your body doesn't want you to do that. That's the reason we grow muscle from training, is to keep the muscle and the tendon and connective tissue from ripping by making it thicker. And it also incidentally gives it the ability to have more strength on top of it. Now what happens is that one of the things you'll notice is you actually get stronger before you get bigger when you first start training. And a lot of people may notice that at first. Like all my lifts went up 20, 30, 40 pounds, and then I started growing. Well, why is that? Because what your body does initially, it also not only doesn't want you to tear muscles, it doesn't want you to gain muscle. So if your body can increase your strength a bit without making you so strong that it's going to risk tearing connective tissue and muscles and everything, your body will go ahead and increase your neuromuscular efficiency initially as a response to training. And it will do that because gaining muscle is metabolically expensive. Gaining too much muscle could make you starve. If food shortages ever come around, muscle doesn't make a good energy reserve, even though it has calories. It's a good energy user. So it doesn't want you to do that. Your body would rather you store fat than store muscle tissue to keep you alive later. So it doesn't want to gain muscle, and when you give it enough cumulative stress, it will gain muscle. Once it realizes it's going to have to keep you from injuring it. But it will increase your neuromuscular efficiency to make you stronger at first. Okay, usually the first 4 to 6 weeks, your body will make you stronger without gaining a lot of muscle, but then it will gain the muscle. Well, the interesting thing is that training itself actually brings you a bit closer, because when you think about it, some people are like, yeah, I mean, my deadlift was, maybe 150 and it went up to 200 pretty quick. But that same situation, you had a woman who pulled 200 or 250 in an emergency situation to pull something off of her child, but you train her for a while, hers will go up to 200. In fact, it will eventually pass that. Well, the interesting thing is training itself removes some of those barriers, because your body realizes you're continually subjecting it to work. It realizes it needs to back those barriers down for you to keep you from hurting yourself, to keep yourself from getting smashed under something. You keep getting under heavy objects and moving them. It realizes you're going to have to be stronger to keep from crushing yourself. So everything that your body is doing is trying to keep you from being injured. But what you find is that the more, when people who train, and people who train with a lot of maxes and very heavy, their strength to weight ratio is better than people who don't train. And obviously people who really train a lot of maxes, their strength to weight ratio is oftentimes better than people who focus purely upon hypertrophy. It's going to be a bit better. Why? What are they doing different? Why are they stronger oftentimes there? Because of neuromuscular efficiency. Their body is letting them tap more into that level of muscle contraction power that it can tap into during an emergency. And what you actually find is that highly trained athletes who compete like at the Olympic level in Olympic lifting and things, their neuromuscular efficiency, when they hit a true max in competition, or you see a big power lifter who's out there really competing at the world level, when they hit a max in competition, which is their 100% effort, they usually peak for that. Keep in mind, they've spent weeks peaking for that to train their nervous system to allow them to dig deeper into there, to use the muscles they have more effectively. They peak. When they get there, they're actually fairly close to that flight or fight strength. Believe it or not, they actually are. I've seen people speculate and calculate that they're actually up to within 90% of that strength. Whereas in the average person might only be at 50% of that strength. Some people in an emergency situation, their strength might double, or in some cases even more in that emergency situation. Whereas in that top level lifter who has trained his nervous system over and over and over with training maxes, he is able to tap in and use something like 90% of his strength, or more, maybe even more of his maximum possible strength when he competes and he's actually psyched up and in competition and focused and doing his thing. They're still not hitting 100% of that fight or flight, life or death strength, but they're getting very close to it. Meaning his 800-pound deadlift might be within 90% or more of it, meaning his life or death deadlift might be 850. But the thing is that you can't control it. It's an interesting thing. It's not one of those things that you can just psych yourself up for and focus on. It has to be spur of the moment, instantaneous. And the problem with it is that it almost always leads to injuries. Like when someone taps into that strength and they pull something or yank something off the ground in that life or death strength, they're almost invariably sore for days, if not weeks. And they damage themselves. They actually oftentimes snap tendons, they rip muscles, things like that when they do that. It has a very high injury rate. Incidentally, you see injuries occasionally from people who are hitting maxes in competition. But that's the thing that you need to remember. Your body is actually strong enough to destroy itself, but it's only going to allow you to do so when it sees a true life or death situation. And the other thing is, I've seen people joke about this. This is where it gets kind of funny. People have joked about fear-based training to where maybe they have a big thug or someone hold a gun over them and threaten to shoot them if they don't lift that weight. Or they get under a weight that they know is going to kill them and that fear response will kick in. So I've heard people joke about that. Just to try to do that. Maybe they should do that with their clients so they can tap into that to get stronger. The problem is that it's not going to build strength. Meaning you're very likely to just injure the person if it were to work. And it's a ridiculous concept, but it makes sense in a way. It's like stupid, but it's not stupid at the same time, because they're like, well, you could technically, lift more weight and that's going to give you better gains, right? It's totally worth it. Well, unless you have a heart attack from the guy jumping out, pulled a gun on your client. But the other problem with it is that because of the chance of injury, it actually would be a terrible training method if we could actually tap into it this way. And I guess psychologically, it could be possible to do this if you were to get the full scare on them, meaning they're not expecting it. It hypothetically could work, but if they're expecting it, it's not going to be the true fear. They know there's nothing to really be afraid of. It's not going to be a knee-jerk reaction, because it's a knee-jerk reaction that you do without thinking. It's just instinct and it kicks in. So if you were to try to find a way to make it kick in externally, the problem is that the injury rate would be phenomenally high, and then the recovery aspect of it. Because look what happens to a top-level lifter sometimes when they hit their lifetime record on a deadlift or a squat or whatever it is. They hit a true competition max for themselves. Look what happens to the recovery. Some of those people can't lift for a week. That does happen on occasion where their strength drops 30%. So for a week, so someone who had a 700-pound deadlift, suddenly they can't even pull 500 pounds 3 days later. That is obviously not going to be good for training. So as a training concept, even if we could tap into this, it would be terrible for gaining strength and for gaining muscle, because you would be so fatigued and your peripheral nervous system would be so exhausted from it that you wouldn't be able to train very often, and you would actually make terrible gains on it, in addition to the fact that you would just have a very high possibility of getting hurt. So while it's an interesting thing for us to look at, and it's interesting to realize for people who train and lift weights, it's actually fascinating to think about the fact that your body is actually stronger than you're able to tap into at any given time. Your muscles are actually capable of producing more force than we ever do in the gym, or that we ever even do in competition. And that's fascinating if you're a very body-oriented person who likes training and lifting, when you really think about that. But at the same time, it also kind of sucks for us, because we know that we can't really tap into it. We wish that we could. It would be nice if we could find a safe way to tap into it and make it work for us in some way. But unfortunately, you can't. Nonetheless, it's still really cool to think about the fact that we know that deep down, our nervous system has put limits on our strength. And our strength potential to keep us from hurting ourselves. Then it also is really fascinating, because it shows us just how truly amazing and sophisticated the human body is as well. The human body is really an amazing machine when you think about it. And I think people who train really become acutely aware of that over the years of training, and just how amazing the human machine is. It really is. It's the most sophisticated machine any of us have ever seen. Alright guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.